The Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. For God has founded it on the seas, established it on the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in God's holy place? Those who have clean hands and pure hearts, who do not lift up their souls to what is false, and do not swear deceitfully. They will receive blessing from the Lord and vindication from the God of their salvation. Such is the company of those who seek God, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your head, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts is the King of glory. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this psalm makes an ageless point. It was made centuries and centuries ago, and it still holds. Although we look at the world differently now, it still holds. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The earth, that is the Lord's property. And as the earlier video sort of, the professor helped us to understand, the earth is the Lord's property, and so are we. We are part of that creation. It is the Lord's care, and so are we. It is the Lord's creation, and so are we. And you know, it's a point that needs to be underlined sometimes, because we are so used to and so beguiled by the notion of private property that we can't help thinking that stuff is ours, that it's there for us. It's there for us to do what we want with it. You know, recently I got myself a glass of water from the fridge, and I was walking around the house just drinking. I walked into Lewis's bedroom. I hadn't drank, I'd just taken a sip of it. I walked into Lewis's bedroom just to say something to him. And as I walked up to him, I said, "Oh, Lewis, by the way," and he just said, "Yeah, Dad," reached out very casually, just took the glass out of my hand, drank it down. And as I looked really casually, he said something to me and then just passed it back, and he said, "Yeah, what do you want?" And I said, "That was my drink." And he said, "Oh, sorry, I thought you were bringing it to me." You know, you just get into the habit. And he's not wrong, actually. 9 times out of 10, if I'd had a drink and I was walking into his room, I was probably bringing him and say, "Do you want a drink?" But we're like that with the world around us. We just are so used to thinking the stuff is for us that we're like Lewis, unthinkingly thinking that there's a Jeeves around who just brings stuff to us. But the psalm reminds us in that sense that we didn't just stumble across this world by accident. It's not the raw material from which we can build our lives. We can't just lay claim to it like explorers of old by planting a flag in it, you know, the way they used to say, "That's ours." The psalm says very boldly, in our context, the earth is the Lord's. In Genesis, we're told, if you like, that it comes to us as a gift, as does life itself. It comes to us perhaps as a task and a collaboration too. And the psalm makes clear that being the case, there's a way of living in this world that corresponds to the conviction that the earth is the Lord's property. That the earth is the Lord's care, that the earth is the Lord's creation. There's a way of living that resonates with God's gift, with God's care, with God's ownership. There's a way of living that's in tune with that. The earth is a gift of God's grace, and it can be cultivated by living in grace and gratitude. Just like our lives. Our lives are gifts of God's grace, and they can be cultivated well by living in grace and gratitude. The psalmist talks about this very simply in terms of living with clean hands and pure hearts. And you know, when we've been reading through Colossians, and Claire read a bit of it at the beginning of the service, Paul makes the same point, doesn't he? Everything created was brought into being in, through, and for Christ. Christ is the fount, the template, the goal of creation. And so, if you can remember back to our thinking on chapter 1 in Colossians, Paul calls us That being the case, to live with faith, hope and love. And so much of Colossians talks about how we should live, rooted in that conviction that Christ is the centerpiece of creation. A life that resonates with that conviction that this world is Christ's care, Christ's gift, Christ's property. A life lived with the grain and not against the grain of the universe. That's why it matters whose world this is, because there is a way of life that is attached to that conviction. For example, if the kings of consumerism really do own the world, those that can buy it up, the Jeff Bezoses of this world, if they own the world, and they've bought up most of it, then live in the world as if it were single use, as though it were at your disposal. Order as much as you like from Amazon and don't worry about the outsized packaging. If the world is theirs, that's the way to go. And if the world belongs to those who have the power to grab it and dominate it, to mass armies on other countries' borders, to drive tanks through the streets, to terrorize populations, then live your life in accordance with that. If those are the ones that own the world, then best become a bully too and grab your own little piece of it. If Boris Johnson is the king of the world, I can't even go there actually. I'll skip that bit. I'll let you ponder that for yourself, what that means. But what the psalm tells us and what Paul tells us in Colossians is it matters who you think the world belongs to. And the gospel says, make no mistake, the earth belongs to Christ. All of it, including you. All of it. And the psalmist hints at why this is a crucial topic. Colossians focus on it even more. And the topic of prayer for today around global warming makes it crystal clear. And that is because creation is tinged with threat. The psalm mentions the waters on which creation is established. And it takes us back to Genesis 1, where it says the Spirit of God was brooding over the chaos and the informity of the deep. And Israel regularly used the waters as an image for chaos that seemed to engulf life and society at times. Do you remember, like in Psalm 69, help me, O Lord, the waters are up to here. They're threatening to wash me away. There's a chaos that's engulfing my life. Or in Psalm 124, where they celebrated, if the Lord had not been on our side when our enemies attacked, the flood would have engulfed us. The torrent would have swept over us. Our whole community was threatened by things beyond our power, and it was like a torrent that would have rushed over us. That's how Israel often pictured the threat of chaos. Paul talks about this in terms of the powers and the principalities, the authorities in heavenly places. Do you remember those invisible things that Paul and that Phil had us trying to draw when we were drawing gravity and complex numbers and emotions, things like that? Claire talked about it, I think it was last week, Blue Monday, where she said, talked about how our moods and our bodies are linked up with the industries and the algorithms and the economies around us. So you can feel down, you're out on your phone trying to find the solution, and it's all triggered by things that we can't see, like travel agencies and like algorithms on the computer feeding into big picture economies. And when we look at climate change, of course, this question of the powers jumps off the page into our lives. Just like the image of the waters being chaotic jumps off the page. If you lived in Bangladesh, that image would be jumping off the page all the time as the sea levels rise and as the storms bring floods. That image of the waters as chaos threatening you personally and your communities would make real sense right now. I think the image of the powers makes sense to us right now. Because can you imagine an alien studying us and maybe seeing the way we live with all the sort of environmental crises at present and asking, well, what's the problem? They know that driving cars poisons the air, destabilises the life system of the planet on which they depend. So why don't they just stop? Can you imagine him zapping down to me and saying, "What are you doing? Why don't you just stop? You know it's doing damage." Or the plastic use, whatever it is, these things. Why don't they just stop? And our answer might be something like, well, it goes beyond me. It's not what I do only. I do what I can with my bag for life, my reusable water bottle, my 3 days a week without meat, my do what you can-uary and vegan-uary stuff. And to tell the truth, I feel a bit of a mug. When giant companies are spewing industrial quantities of pollution into the seas, rivers and air, superpowers are ramping up fossil fuels, my bag for life doesn't seem to count for a great deal. And if our alien then headed off to the heads of the big companies, and they would say the same, well, we're working on it, but we can't go too fast because other companies are going slower. And they'll outdo us, and we've got employees and we've got shareholders. And if the alien got to the heads of state eventually, maybe went to China or America or Britain and said, well, why don't you lead the way? And they'd say, well, if they were talking in China, for example, they'd say, well, the West has been doing this for 100 years or more. We're trying to play catch up. And if we stop now, we'll lose our advantage. Always sending it up. Where would the alien go next? Who's really responsible? And it's in that kind of context that Paul talks of principalities and powers, vested interest systems that gain their own momentum, models that impose methods that reduce us to slaves, powers above that are spiritual, political, economic, shaping our lives and perhaps diminishing our lives. But as Claire said last week, Paul brings this up not as a counsel of despair. Instead, it is to say that we should think well as to how we live. Because for the psalm, the Lord is coming, mighty in battle. For Colossians, Christ has defeated the powers, and resurrection life is, even as we speak, drawing creation towards healing and peace. And so both psalmist and Paul join together in saying, so think well about how you live. If the earth is the Lord's, then the smart money's on clean hands and pure hearts. If everything is in, through and for Christ, then the smart money is on faith, hope and love. The smart money, that is to say, is on living God's way in God's world. Because finally the psalmist knows that the Lord is coming, that the Lord is not absent. The earth is waiting to be visited over and over again. And yes, finally, lift up your heads, you gates, that the King of glory may come in. Paul says the same thing when he talks about Christ as the firstborn from the dead, a seed of life in a dying world. Christ, the hope of glory. The earth is waiting for Christ's renewal. Because the world is God's, given as a home to be nurtured and called for, to be lived in responsively, to love grace, to the grace that gave it, because Christ has come, showing that this is God's home as well as ours, in God's choice. And above all, pointing to us that there is a way of living in God's world, a way of living with the grain, a way that includes caring for and about God's creation, all of it. And it certainly makes no sense to be burning down the house when the Lord is returning to dwell. Amen. Let's